Ladies and gentlemen, hey, hi, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for stopping by. Within Warzone now, obviously with the MW3 integration, we've got a pretty expansive weapon arsenal. We've got the 70 plus MW2 weapons, then of course all the new MW3 weapons, making for a lot of options when it comes to what you want to choose on your loadouts when you're dropping in game. And today we are going through and breaking down the entire Modern Warfare 3 Warzone meta, going over all the MW2 and MW3 guns and ranking them in their respective categories, whether they are absolute meta or more mid-tier or complete garbage and you never want to use them. So as we get into it, if you enjoy the video, if you find it helpful at all, do me a favor, drop a like on it. It would be really appreciated. And if you're new here or if you're part of that 50% of viewers watching who are not already subscribed, let's change that, because every single day I got you covered with news, updates, patch notes, meta breakdowns like this. So feel free to hit that sub button and turn on those post notifications. So we're here on this brand new tier list that I've made that features, as I mentioned, all of the MW2 guns and all of the MW3 guns. We got a lot to break down here today. Now we got our respective categories similar to our previous tier list from the recent years. Absolute meta obviously being the best of the best, top tier being borderline meta, extremely good. There might be some faults here and there. Competitive, for the most part, these are very good guns, but they're not the absolute best in the game. Average, which really I want to rename to mediocre, because average isn't really the average, otherwise we'd have the majority of weapons here. But I think by the end of this list, most will be between competitive and average. Below average, which is just kind of they're weapons, but you probably don't want to use them. Niche, obviously meant for very specific situations, so they could be really good or could be really bad, but they're only used for like one or two things. And then garbage, obviously you want to avoid these. Now keep in mind, as we're going through all of these guns, this right here is just a sort of preliminary ranking. Obviously, we've had a limited time in game to get a true sample size of using all these guns. Now, I've gone through and spent a lot of time testing out all these guns, so I do have some game knowledge, and also looking at all the stats, ones that True Game Data might have up on his site, or the in-game stuff, and comparing things here and there. But this is still pretty early on into the year, so this will be fine-tuned and updated over time as we obviously get more playtime, more experience, and we see new meta updates go live to buff and nerf various things. But without further ado, let's get into it. We're just going to start at the top of the list here and go through all the way down. So first up, the M4. The thing with a lot of the MW2 rifles, or anything you're using from mid to long range still, is that they feel like the MW2 guns did last year, with a lot of noise visually. There's a lot of screen shake, bounce, idle sway is kind of obnoxious. So I think this is more of a competitive option there as of now. The SO14, kind of the same deal, even though it's obviously a different class of weapon. It's got its good upsides in terms of its full auto TTK being pretty good still, but there is that skill gap of recoil, which would limit it from being top tier absolute meta. Probably a little bit more useful on resurgence than standard BR. The TAC V, honestly, it's probably borderline mediocre and competitive. We'll give it the benefit of the doubt right now and say it's competitive, but this is one that so far hasn't really stood out much to me. Again, outside of maybe resurgence gameplay, where it's a little bit more versatile because of the closer engagements overall. The FTAC Recon, despite it being ridiculously powerful, I'm going to say is more of a mediocre tier weapon, because one, it's so limited in ammo, and then two, just the skill gaps involved there with it being semi-auto. You got to be deadly accurate, so the drawbacks here make it a bit more mediocre than its upsides of insane damage, right? The MW2 SMGs here, and obviously with these are kind of like mixed and matched. It's not just all straight categories back to back for whatever reason, but all the MW2 SMGs are competitive enough, it seems. There are certain standouts for sure. The Vel, absolutely, in my opinion, is a more competitive one, just because it does have that extended range that other subs just don't have, while also being super low recoil as well. So that's definitely a choice that to me stands out. But SMGs in this game right now are still kind of awkward, and we'll talk a bit more on that as we get throughout the other options in the list. Now, unfortunately, the MX9, as fun as it is, super agile, very aggressive, and honestly a decent TTK, again, so limited by its magazine capacity that it just can't hang with the other options. So that is a huge sort of a limiter there in how good it can actually be. The Lockman sub MP5 absolutely is a top tier choice still. I mean, there's not really a huge surprise here. It was a go-to sub, arguably the #1 or #2 sub for all of Warzone 2. So it's still pretty good here in MW3 Warzone, where it really hasn't seen too many changes and can compete with the other top tier SMG choices. The Vaznev is kind of a tricky one for me. I'd say this one is more so borderline competitive top tier. its damage drop off is so harsh, and the MP5's is as well, but the MP5 also has the mobility benefits, in my opinion, a little bit cleaner sights, easier to use. I'd be choosing the MP5 over the Vaznev currently, and for that reason, I'm out. But I do think it's more so of a competitive choice, rather top tier. But that one is definitely, you know, fringe on the line there for sure. The Hurricane, another tricky one, but in the sense of being borderline mediocre competitive. It's got the magazine capacity. Its TTK is not phenomenal, but it's also really easy to use. Basically, no shake, no control negatives there. So we'll give it the benefit of the doubt for now and say it's competitive. Obviously, as we continue to place more options into each of these tiers, we might be adjusting some things as I see fit, as I start to see, you know, the stats compare more in my head as we get them placed out. The Mini Bach, definitely mediocre, borderline below average. I mean, it's got insane magazine capacity, but its damage isn't really anything all that crazy. Below average, I kind of have planned out in my opinion, so we'll see how it sort of plays out. But yeah, the Mini Bach is not something that is crazy. I guess mediocre would be a great definition for it, because it's just kind of in every way possible, right? The P90, definitely a competitive option for sure, right up there with the Vel. It's got great magazine capacity, pretty low recoil, great mobility, and really good range for an SMG as well. So that one's definitely a standout for me. TAC 56 definitely up there in terms of ease of use, but again, its damage, especially compared to some of the MW3 rifles, which are pretty crazy right now, is going to be lacking some. So that one is a bit limited currently, but that could change in the future. If you're looking for a straightforward and easy MW2 gun though, obviously the TAC 56 has been that for some time. The Fennec, I'm not gonna lie, I feel like is more of a top tier choice, especially for like the ultra close range. We'll get to the Swarm obviously when we talk about the MW3 guns, but their behaviors are pretty similar. That first damage range on the Fennec is pretty spicy, and if you can build it out for mobility and still handle the shake and the bounce that it has, it can be pretty nasty. I've fried with this a little bit, been melted by it as well, so it's definitely up there in terms of some of the top tier SMGs for now. Shotguns are a little bit tricky. The Lockwood 300, I feel like kind of has to be in mediocre just because it's so unforgiving if you miss a shot. Now, obviously, if you're landing your shots, it's probably going to be competitive top tier for sure in the close range meta, but if you miss one, you're probably done, especially with how fast that close range TTK is now. So that one definitely is either really good if you're a really good player or really average if you're not a great player. The Expedite, based off of its damage overall, probably going to be more of a mediocre one as well. You can spam it, but I do think there are some better options in the shotgun class that we're going to get to whenever they pop up in the list here. Bryson 800, again, kind of same deal. Kind of unforgiving if you're missing your shots, but really good if you are hitting them. And same deal with the 890. I mean, all MW2 shotties were kind of like this the entire year in Warzone 2, and it's more of the same here so far, at least in Warzone 3 for at least these initial base ones here. Zach and MG38, I'd view as a competitive option for sure as of right now, mainly just because of its ease of use. It's one of the lower recoil, lower visual noise MW2 guns, so it definitely has that going for it alongside a pretty decent TTK over long range, so you can get by using that one. HCR is going to be up there as well, being pretty solid, almost the same deal as the Sakin. Super low recoil, very straightforward, very easy to use. The Icarus, for me, just not really doing it. It feels a little bit underwhelming, especially when you get out to some of the ranges there. Even though its TTK is all right, its control and its overall feel and handling is a little bit awkward so far. So that one to me does fall down a little bit. I'd be taking the Sakin or the HCR over it currently. The RAL, absolutely a competitive choice. We know this was a powerhouse. This was a beast all throughout Warzone 2. Still feeling pretty solid here in MW3 Warzone. The control still kind of awkward, kind of funky because it's got like just, it feels so powerful. That's the thing. Its handling is super slow, obviously, it being an LMG, but when you're shooting it, it feels really strong, but that comes with the cons of slow and control being kind of iffy. The RPK is probably a bit more borderline competitive and mediocre, but again, for the same reasoning with some of these that we've already seen, I'd be choosing the RPK over the Icarus for its better, I guess, versatility, more of like an AR LMG style gun versus the Icarus, which could be built to be more like a heavy rifle, still just feeling kind of awkward, kind of funky. The Cast-Off 7.62, certainly a competitive rifle as it stands now. Definitely was up and down throughout the year in Warzone 2. So far this year, its damage is feeling decent, especially for Resurgence. I find this to be a bit more viable than on Battle Royale. So certainly one that is going to feel familiar if you're interested in that. The Wrap, one of my favorite guns throughout Warzone 2. Obviously, I was ranting and raving about this one season after season. Definitely still feeling solid here in Warzone 3. The thing is here is that when you compare this to other MW3 LMGs, that's where the distinctions start to be a bit more obvious, and obviously we'll see that in the graph as we get to it later on. We get to some of the marksmans and like the battle rifles here. The EBR probably going to end up being more mediocre than it is anything else, just because of lack of forgiveness. Again, it's really powerful, limited in ammo though, and if you're missing shots, that TTK does suffer pretty drastically there. Fun and definitely a high skill gap weapon though. The SPR, definitely mediocre as well. It's a quick scope rifle, but it doesn't do insane damage or anything as of now. I'd love to see this turn into something that could one-shot headshot within like, 40 meters or something in the future. I think that'd be really healthy for the sniper meta, but for now, not really anything crazy. The MK2, definitely below average here. It just doesn't have power. It's fun. It's like that little cowboy quick scope style weapon, and I think it's a ton of fun to run around with, but that's more so meant for multiplayer and not really here in Warzone. LMS, the fire rate and the handling here just doesn't seem to keep up much with the other options in the category. So while the other options are just straight up mediocre, this one definitely isn't even competing with those, despite the fact that it does have pretty crazy damage. Just not a fan of how this feels or how it performs when stacked up against other choices that are much easier to use, even when these do have higher skill gaps as well. The SAB kind of just right there with the SPR as well, very similar feeling overall. And the TAC M, despite having a fire rate that's probably closer to the LMS and weird handling there, does again feel a little bit more forgiving. So that one's going to be slightly better, but this one's certainly borderline, mediocre, below average, at least in my opinion, for sure. Now, for snipes, this is a tricky one because the sniper meta is not where it should be right now. So a lot of them are just going to end up being grouped together, I feel like, in a place that's not all that great, just because the lack of one-shots. You have to use explosive rounds, for instance, on the MCPR. That to me really limits it. So for now, I feel like these almost have to be mediocre placed. The Signal could be considered maybe a little more competitive just because you can spam it. So maybe for now that's sort of like a standout MW2 snipe, but I do think that there needs to be a lot of work done on the snipers to make a healthier meta there overall. Lab gonna be right there with the SAB and the SPR. The Lockman 5.56, this one's kind of like back and forth with me for mediocre and competitive because its damage is a little underwhelming at times, but it also has sort of the same ease of use that like a TAC 56 would have. So for now, we'll drop that into competitive. I think they're all certainly decent to a certain extent, at least the MW2 rifles are. But again, their comparison to MW3, that's where the differences really shine. SPX gonna end up falling right there with the SPR, the LAB, the other sort of bolt action aggressive snipers and marksmen. Obviously, Riot Shield niche, that's one sort of self-explanatory, no surprises there. A lot of these MW2 pistols, not really going to be doing it for me. The Basilisk, I feel like the only time you're ever using this is as a snake shot option, so that's me sort of self-explanatory with niche as well. You're only using it in those specific situations that would, adhere to the strengths of an akimbo, magnum in that case. So you're only using it super close range. It has no other use outside of that definition of niche right there. P890, gonna be more of a mediocre pistol. 50 GS, kind of garbage if I'm being honest with you. It could be niche as well, but it's not really good whatsoever. X12, gonna be mediocre as like a starter pistol, a base pistol. X13 auto, I mean, it would be more competitive if one other gun didn't exist that we'll talk about later on into the video. So again, more of a mediocre choice with that. All the launchers obviously going to be niche, so we can quickly knock those out. Same deal with the knife as it's coming up here. No need to go in depth about all those. Obviously, they're not really true competitive options. STB, this one is kind of tricky as well because of its magazine capacity. Sort of the same deal that we see, with the MX9, for instance, but it's super easy to use, and its ease of use stats, I think, in and of itself, combined with an actual decent TTK, I think kind of bring it back up despite it being limited with its ammo there. RPG obviously going into the niche area as well. M13B, I feel like this one's kind of tough because out of the MW2 rifles, this is one I feel like does thrive a little bit more, but calling it top tier is kind of tricky because of just how good the MW3 rifles are. And spoiler alert, they're largely going to be in the top tier category. This is one for now I'm going to put at the top of competitive, and we might revisit this as we get later on into the list and we see how things pan out. The Bass B for me's got to be a top tier SMG as well, just because of its range benefits versus the other SMGs. While it is similar to the MP7 and the P90 in that regard, the Bass P does stand out a little bit more. I also find it a little bit easier to use in some cases, a little bit more aggressive in certain instances as well, depending on how you're building it out. This is one that I think does really shine as like a sniper support style SMG, but could be used a little bit more versatile as well. Victus gonna unfortunately fall victim to the same deal as the other bolt action snipers there. The M16, it don't matter how you build it, how you use it. It could be semi-auto, could be burst, still gonna be garbage. I don't think there's any hope for the M16 whatsoever. Astov 74U unfortunately just doesn't really feel like it's competing as well in terms of overall damage here. So for now, I think we're gonna have that as more of like a mediocre sniper support option. And that's really where it's gonna be used exclusively. It doesn't have anything going on for the range there whatsoever. 545, kind of the same deal as the TAC 56, the M4, mediocre damage, but it's super easy to use. Basically no recoil for an MW2 gun. It's in the lower side of things for that, so it'll be competitive at best for that. Lockman 762, I'd say, is competitive for the players that are good at controlling hard to use weapons. This is a high skill gap weapon for sure. We'll put it up there with the SO14. You want to use this in full auto. Resurgence is where this is going to stand out more than core battle royale because the engagement types. Using it in semi-auto, not really all that great. I'd probably have that as more of a mediocre option. Full auto though, as we know, it can be pretty insane. Chimera for me, easy top tier rifle choice. It's about time we see an MW2 rifle certainly in top tier. For sniper support, the mid-range, even like as an AR SMG hybrid, the thing is nasty. Definitely one of my favorite choices for that style of play. KV Broadside is going to be one of the shotguns, one of the few shotguns that I consider to be competitive as of right now, especially from MW2. It's just so easy to use. You can spam it. Pretty self-explanatory there. Hemlock gonna fall in place with all the other MW2 rifles. Lower recoil-ish, decent damage, makes for something that's relatively easy to use. Crossbow obviously going to be niche there. Tempest Torrent, in my opinion, probably falls more so into the mediocre category than it would competitive. Even though you can spam this thing, it's a little bit inconsistent feeling at times, at least with MW3 weapons in the mix. FJX Imperium falling victim to the same deal there. Cronin Squall probably on the more competitive side of things in terms of the battle rifles here. It was sort of up and down again all throughout the year in Warzone 2. I imagine that's probably going to be the case this year because you can flip-flop back and forth between semi-auto and full auto. You got different ways to sort of build it out and style it for Resurgence or Battle Royale, and it can be effective in a variety of different ways. FTAC Siege is definitely a pistol that I would say is probably more so on the competitive side of things versus mediocre. However, there are MW3 pistols that stand out again more than these do, so we'll get to that when we cross that bridge. GS Magna also garbage tier right there with the 50 GS, just nothing going on there. The Razorback definitely is up there in terms of borderline top tier competitive for the similar reasons of the Chimera. You could use this as really solid sniper support. I do think because this is a bit more difficult to use in some cases, a little bit slower and heavier than the Chimera, it'll stay in competitive for now, but that's one I've got my eye on for sure. We're coming up on the MW3 guns. We're actually getting through this pretty quick. ISO 45, definitely a top tier SMG in my opinion, maybe the best MW2 SMG. Been using this one a lot as like a mainstay in my loadouts, combining some MW3 primaries with this as a secondary, and it's feeling really, really good. MX Guardian shotgun, to me, it's close with the broadside, but I'd be taking the broadside over it. For now, I'm going to say this is more of a mediocre choice overall. FR Avancer, definitely top tier, right there with the Chimera in terms of a nice hybrid style rifle, really good TTK. Can be kind of tricky to use. It's something you have to work on to get used to and familiar with, but after you master it, you're pretty much set there. The Carrick, honestly, is not a sniper I like the feel of whatsoever, but it can be spammed similar to the Signal. I just take the Signal over it every day, so we'll call it mediocre with the other snipes for now. M13C is one that I'm sort of borderline again. It's got decent stats this time around, close to the Chimera and FR Avancer in terms of where you want to use it, but I'd be taking those over it. I'm not super sold on the feel of it so far there. Lockman Shroud, definitely a more mediocre competitive style SMG because it can be spammed pretty quick. I'd say maybe we give it the benefit of the doubt with competitive, but that's one that I do think is more so based around how good you are as a player rather than just being able to pick it up and fry with it. Damon going to be right there with the other pistols as well. The Geist is a rifle, certainly can be borderline top tier and competitive here. Again, we're going to give more of the MW2 guns the competitive tier, though, just because of reasons that we'll discuss in just a bit. And then lastly, ISO 9mm, I think is right up there with the ISO 45. Close range dominance, it's feeling pretty good there. We then get into all the MW3 guns. So real quick, we'll knock out some of the niche ones that I'm already looking at. The Gutter Knife and the Karambit obviously going to fall there. The RGL going to fall in there with the other launchers as well. Also, if I can spot it real quick, the tier, same deal as the Basilisk, obviously only being used like akimbo, super close range there. And then Stormender, it's not even a true competitive, realistic option. It's just there for fun. Now we can talk about the more serious options here. The SVA, immediately an MW3 rifle falling into the top tier category. The difference between MW3 guns and MW2 guns right now, especially over the mid to long range, is how much easier they are to use, while also having equal if not better TTKs. The idle sway is better on the MW3 guns, it seems like. The visual recoil, obviously way better than the MW3 guns. The versatility of the MW3 guns feels like it stands out more as well. So while there are good options for MW2 rifles, MW3 ones just stand out far, far more in my opinion as it stands. The Striker, definitely going to be a top tier SMG choice here. It's got some range benefits that really, lean in its favor versus some of these other ones. Mobility, ease of use yet again. It's feeling very strong, very competitive so far. Also, the Swarm, as I mentioned, it's got that close range, first damage range. It's only like 5 or 6 meters, but it fries right there. And then beyond that, it's still right there with some of the other best SMGs. So that one certainly is top tier as well. The AMR9 is easily below average, but I might call it straight up garbage. This thing's TTK sucks. I hate the feel of this thing. It's not a good SMG, and that's the same deal in multiplayer as well. That thing's got nothing going for it. The Wasp 9 is probably going to be more of a competitive option than a top tier one, just because, while it is super easy, kind of reminds me of the Milano from Cold War, I would be taking the Striker over it for that sort of like mid-range style gameplay right now. Rival 9 absolutely is going to be a top tier SMG. This thing's got the mobility, the fast close range TTK as well. The Striker 9 also is surprisingly good for range even. Close range is decent, but even over the mid range, this thing's actually pretty surprising. When I was checking out the stats here and also testing some sniper support style stuff on it, felt really, really good, and I was pleasantly surprised with that. The Lockwood 680, definitely going to be a more competitive tier shotgun. Obviously, it's a bit limited in its range versus some of the subs, and you have to be a little bit more accurate with it, so that's why it does sort of border there between top tier and competitive. To me, the ease of use factor of SMGs being able to spray and pray does make those stand out a little bit more. The Haymaker, ooh, this one's tough because this one is kind of busted for close range. We'll give it the benefit of the doubt. Like I said, this is preliminary rankings. We'll fine tune this over time. We'll say the Haymaker for now is a top tier shotgun. I would be taking it over the Lockwood as of now. The Riveter, not it. I'm going below average for this thing. Maybe borderline garbage if I'm being honest. Does not feel good whatsoever. Kilomeot 762, I'm going to say is more of a competitive LMG here overall. We'll put it in with the other LMGs in the category here. Just because there are some other LMGs in the category that really stand out. We'll see. I might bump this one up to top tier given where we place the other ones. We'll see how it plays out. MTZ 556, absolutely a top tier rifle as well. Super versatile, sniper support, mid to long range. You can kind of build it out for a bunch of different styles there. The DG58 LSW, surprisingly good for an LMG. You look at the stats here and its TTK is really good, and it's also very easy to use. So pleasantly surprised that this is one that is actually up towards the top of the meta. The Holger 26, to me, I don't know if I'd take this. Its stats are good. Its TTK is good. I don't know if I would take this over the DG or some potential other LMGs. I think for now we'll leave it in competitive because the DG is one that I have enjoyed using more than the Holger. The Bruin, our first absolute meta option. It's just because some of these absolute meta ones are later on down the list, but this thing is nasty. Its TTK is insane. Really feels more like an AR LMG hybrid when you build it out to be like the MW 2019 Bruin with that 60 round mag. This thing is a ton of fun to use. One of my favorite guns in the game right now. The KVD Enforcer is going to end up being more of like a mid-tier battle rifle, marksman style rifle. Not really a huge fan of the feel of this one in particular. The MCW 6.8 I'd say is probably more competitive just because you do have the conversion kits here that make it feel a bit more strong, a bit more versatile there, and a little easier to use. The DM56, I gotta say, currently is like absolute, oh, this one's tough because it does have a skill gap factored in. Maybe it's absolute meta in terms of damage. I'll say that. You guys have seen the broken setups video. This thing fries for the close range and the mid range, sort of like the FAL, but it being semi-auto and it having sniper ammo maybe does limit it just enough that it's just top tier instead of absolute meta. That's kind of a tricky one for sure. Next up, we got the Holger 5.56. This to me definitely would be absolute meta in terms of the rifles, just because that first damage range is so good. So like for Resurgence, this thing's gonna fry. It's also super low recoil and really easy to use over range. The MCW, we're gonna say this one is competitive. And I say that just because its TTK is so much slower than the other options, but it's also so much easier to use. It's almost borderline top tier because of how easy it is to use, but I'd say from a damage standpoint, it's more competitive because a lot of the MW3 guns do have that ease of use going for them. DG58, this one's going to be absolute meta, crazy good burst weapon, no surprise there. And the FR556, quite frankly, might be the best rifle in the game. This thing's absolutely nuts in terms of its TTK and its ease of use for a burst weapon as well. Bass B is the best gun in the game by a mile, and I fully anticipate that's going to change here, but that thing is absolutely nuts. We've got the Sidewinder, which in terms of TTK isn't as far down as you might think compared to like the MTZ, for instance, but its recoil and its fire rate just feel awful. I'm going garbage tier for that. It's definitely below average at best, but I kind of want to be mean to it, so we're going to go for garbage. MTZ 762, I'd say, is more of a competitive option as well. It's decent overall in terms of control. TTK stats are pretty competitive too. The Interceptor is actually surprisingly good. That said, there is a much larger skill gap, I'd say, with this versus like a DM56 for being semi-auto guns, so we'll give this one more of a competitive ranking for now, but that's one that does definitely stand out to me as like sort of a surprise pick, and one that I think is going to be slept on for some time. The Cat AMR definitely is going to be top tier as a sniper. I don't think it's absolute meta just because it is still really slow and really heavy, but it's that sniper that can one shot no matter what ammo type you're using, and that gives it a significant advantage over every other snipe in the game for sure. The longbow probably going to be mixed in here with some of the other snipes, if I'm being honest with you, mainly just because its damage doesn't really feel all that crazy given most situations there. And then the inhibitor, I'd say, is a little bit more competitive than the other options, sort of as like a standalone. It feels more like a marksman rifle than it does a sniper, in my opinion. So we'll drop that one in sort of with those. We then get some of the pistols. The Core 45, probably going to be more mediocre with the other ones. The Renetti, though. The Renetti exists, and this is why things like the FTAC Siege and the X13 Auto cannot be considered competitive, in my opinion, because you put on the conversion kit on the Renetti, and it's basically a mini SMG, and that to me is so much better than the SMG versions of the X13 or the FTAC Siege. It absolutely is my go-to real pistol option if I needed one there. The Stinger is definitely close as well, although it's a little bit more difficult to use than the full auto Renetti in my opinion, so we'll give this one just a more mediocre rating. The TAC Eradicator, obviously being one of the new weapons here that we just got a couple of weeks back, is definitely more of a competitive LMG option. It's really interesting how the control changes when it's doing its fast bursts versus its slower fire rate, and really I would say it's probably more borderline top tier competitive, but it's inconsistent recoil might throw some people off, but it's one that I'm keeping my eye on as well. The Ram 7, this one I would say is probably going to be absolute meta as well, especially for sniper support, more so than, you know, the FR Avancer or the Chimera, because its close range, like first damage range TTK, is absolutely nuts. Then lastly, we've got the Stalker, which unfortunately, again, it can't one-shot crazy, so we're just going to go in with all the other snipes mixed into one. And that is every single MW2 and MW3 weapon so far ranked. A lot of conversation here, a lot of details, but it's a competitive meta, and that's good. Obviously, we've got a lot, like I said, in competitive and mediocre, where the bulk of weapons should be for a healthy meta. There are a few standouts that I think probably need to be nerfed, but there's also a lot of really good, really dominant choices that I think most competitive players will want to be running on their setup, and mix and match between really anything in these top two categories. Nice to see that there's not a ton that are completely unusable, which is always good for a healthy meta as well. Also, quick little post edit Zach here. Now that I've gone through the list and I was editing this, there are some few things that I wanted to change, so this quick little top portion of the list updated a tad bit. MTZ Interceptor, as we've already seen, should be considered absolute meta if you are a decent player who can aim consistently, because the thing just wrecks. The Pulum Yacht, definitely absolute meta with the conversion kit on there as well. I did also want to bump up the TAC Eradicator in a top tier, just because if you can consistently land shots at this thing too, especially with that first burst and that fire rate's faster, the thing can melt as well. But that's going to wrap things up. I'm sure plenty of you will have differing opinions because your favorite weapon isn't in a tier that you think it should be. Feel free to drop your comments down below on your thoughts on how the meta shakes out right now. That is going to wrap things up. If you enjoyed it, do me a favor, drop a like on the video itself. And if you're new here, feel free to hit that subscribe button on your way out as well. But once again, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, take it easy. Have an awesome rest of your day. And I'll catch you later. Peace out.